So we're here. Tim Anstey, who is my old friend and in some respects colleague, who just published a very interesting big book called Things That Move, a hinterland of architecture history, which is a pretty huge and book that contains a lot of stuff that's really new to me. So it was a really challenging read to actually look at this book, but it begins at least somewhere where I feel at home, with Vitruvius.
Sure.
The introduction is called Cinnabar and Quicksand.
Quicksilver. No, not quicksand. Two different things. Quicksilver.
Quicksilver. Sorry, I wrote quicksand, but it could
maybe quicksand is not a bad term, perhaps.
Quicksilver. Stability and metamorphosis and the stable and the transient, etc. You have these questions, what is the inside and outside of architecture? What is architecture?
Sure.
That's what you post. We post that particularly in respect to Vitruvius and the three concepts you find in Vitruvius. So these three concepts, which are they and how should we understand them?
Yeah, I think I hated Vitruvius. It was like the most boring read at architecture school. It was like the one thing I hated, and so all my life.
I agree.
Well, I think now it's not, but I think so. This is like the discovery of why it might not be so boring. And one of the fun things about it, I guess, is he makes a claim that architecture is partly all the things in Vitruvius that we think are boring, about putting everything in the right place when you're building. But he also talks about architecture being about time, time and orientation, I suppose, and a sort of cosmic relationship. And he also talks about architecture as being the coordination of things in physical movement. And so there's three different things that he says that's what architecture comprises.
And I think your book is about edificatio, gnomonic, and machinatio. So your book is about machinatio.
Well, the book is I think the book is about all three, but it's a claim that
it goes towards this.
It says that these other two, these gnomonice, the cosmic orientation, or the machinatio, the moving things around, is built into or is entwined in the first. So it concentrates on the others.
Of course, on the cover of the book you might see in here, it's a photo by Abbe Warburg, right?
It's a photograph by Abbe Warburg.
What is it?
It's in Pasadena, photographed in...
He just happened to see a house that was...
a very, very Warburg image. So that he's in the West, on his way to the Pueblo Indians, or having been to the Pueblo Indians, he's in Pasadena, where they're already moving houses around in the city, and it's as iconic as his photograph of the in the snake ritual lecture of the white man in the classical building in the New World.
So this Vitruvian triad, which is different from the Firmitas.
Absolutely,
it's a different triad than the one that we're normally accustomed to reading in Vitruvius. Then again, you start off in a big section called cargoes, and we'll come back to the chronology here, which is interesting how you divide it chronologically. But it's called cargoes. It begins with a treatise that I never heard of, but which perhaps most people haven't, on naval architecture by Chapman from 1768. A Swedish naval architect, and you say you make these interesting claims, and you say a lot of things about him. But I think one thing which is interesting is that you point out the way he made innovations in architectural drawing.
Absolutely.
How he transformed the stable images into things that float and sweep. Can you say something about how?
Sure. I think in one way it's very natural to start a book about. The book's called A Hinterland of Architectural History. So in one way, if you've not met any of the bits, it's kind of succeeded, because the argument is there's a whole lot of stuff parked around which we haven't looked at. And of course, if you're going to talk about architecture in terms of movement, naval architecture is the place to start, because we accept it as a term, we never think about it, but it's a term that has its history, and so this chapter's about that history. So in some ways, Chapman is a very convenient cipher. We're sitting in Stockholm, and the book's partly about Stockholm and being in Stockholm and understanding Sweden. So it's partly of that. But I think Chapman's thesis is, well, it's an incredibly beautiful book with the most amazing images in it, which are very odd and extraordinary to look at as an architect, because they're images that are very, very precise, but are not based on perfect symmetry, even though they're images of symmetrical objects. He does these very, very odd images which are sort of taking apart technically what it is for a ship to move. So he draws ships listing at an angle, at obliquely, so he draws ships in all the ways where they do not appear symmetrical. And his theoretical work is all about calculating a fluid notion of stability, which is not stability as in stability like this, but stability as in what makes this go back to being vertical. And that's in a way another way of thinking certain architectural terms, you could say.
But I think I mean for those who do not live in Stockholm, there's still a ship called Chapman, which is the youth hostel, right?
Yeah.
Which is the first time I ever came to Stockholm. I stayed at this boat off Chapman, so I think it's very engraved into memory of all people who ever came to Stockholm. So
and it's. I think the other thing is Chapman is also interesting in terms of you were talking about chronology, and why stop just there? But the book is kind of caught up with certain moments which seem in some way to be hiatus moments, and I mean Chapman you can locate in a much bigger kind of history of ideas change in terms of Diderot and this encyclopedia and the new ideas about survey and topography, which are kind of all operating at the same time, and in which of course the methods of drawing blossom and develop all the way from in this particular. But I think the thing that made it very engaging is it's. I mean, the book says about peripheries or hinterlands, and this is a thesis that's produced in the sort of Stockholm syndrome as academics, as you think you're on the edge, and this is like an incredibly kind of important book that's produced in that context, which maybe means you have to rethink its edginess as well, which is fun. So it's a book that's kind of been very instrumental.
I think there is something else that also underlies the entire book. I think it is regardless now whether we will come back to these historical divisions, but this is also the moment of colonialism and trade and power projections. So obviously naval architecture is also part of the fleet. I mean, Sweden still being on the periphery. Was that part of Chapman's conception? Or
well, I would say in a broader way. I mean, the reason, and I suppose my in some ways research is a little bit happenstance, but one of the fun things about this story is I was interested in if you're rethinking what architecture is in terms of movement, then ship architecture or naval architecture seems a good place to go. And what became very odd, which more or less fell out of the Royal Library in Stockholm, which is a kind of sum of Sweden's intellectual history, is they have a whole corpus of another architectural history, which is about naval architecture, which parallels the history we know of architecture. And it parallels it almost thesis by thesis and innovation by innovation. Very, very, very strange. And in that story, in that bigger history, the issue of power and the way in which sort of architectural motifs can be transported in the interests of either subverting or affirming power is very, very strong. So that Chapman himself is drawing on traditions which go back to Louis XIV and the French Academy, where they sort of start outspokenly saying, everyone knows about architecture, military and civil. We've forgotten about ships, but ships are the things that export power. So it's a sort of interesting partie to look at.
If one thinks about the exportation of power in Sweden, you will think about the great naval architectural failure, the Vasa ship, the sacrifice.
Yeah, but that's sort of a bit.
I thought you would say something about that.
No, I don't think that's so interesting. It's sort of a bit.
It's too famous.
It's like a one-liner.
It's a one-liner, but it should be somewhere. Okay, it doesn't matter.
Maybe it should be. Maybe.
No, it doesn't matter.
That's a very good point.
But I'm thinking you have this outward movement, naval architecture, but then you have also movement inwards, the second chapter, towards the interior, which I found very fascinating. And just as power was being projected outwards, the colonial structure and the fleet naval architecture were part of that, we also have the discovery of the invention even of the interior. As you say, around 1800, we had interior, which we use constantly. They really got this new sense. Can you say something about the interior?
Well,
It's fascinating.
I think, so I think it is that it's both an expansion inwards and outwards, so that that sighting of, or the intriguing thing about sort of naval architecture being about moving power and parts within sort of traditions of mapping and drawing and recording. The next chapter in the book thinks about the way in which that sort of macro level change, which for the sake of the book is sort of the 17th, second half of the 18th century in Europe, has implications for conceptions of architecture, and the sort of piece it takes. So each chapter kind of takes a kind of a little sort of one little example. It suggests that in the 18th century an interior was the inside of a country or a continent. By the beginning of mid-1820, an interior is something where you leave your umbrella, as I relate. And it argues that there's a transference there, that in some ways that development of that notion of architecture and architecture of insides that's minutely curated is part of effectively commodifying, but also kind of articulating hidden things which are driving the society that is doing that decoration. And I find it extremely interesting.
You have Chapman the first, you have this guy Thomas Hope.
Thomas Hope, amazing character.
The protagonist in the second chapter. Who was Thomas Hope? I never heard of him.
Thomas Hope, what a mover. I mean, he's a... And the other thing about the whole book is it's a little bit about bankers and money, it is mortgaged to kind of strange people, including Wahlberg. So you could say, if you know who Wahlberg is, which maybe doesn't help, he's an earlier version of A.B. Wahlberg. He's a banker who very rich, global, working in a family company that controls global trade to an extraordinary extent. He's part of the syndicate, or his family bank is part of the syndicate that sells half of America to America from France. But he's also someone who takes it upon himself, with no training, to change people's tastes in terms of the way they think about furniture and what we now call interior design. And at the same time, he's someone who's, a little bit eerily a kind of Generation X digital nomad. I mean, he's kind of scarily mobile. I mean, it's already then in the 1790s, the power of money to allow this guy he can set up in Constantinople, he can set up in Cairo and do his stuff, simply because of this sort of horrendous global grip, which is ensuring an income. And he produces a very odd but interesting treatise called Household Furniture.
What you're tracing is this double thing. First you have the outward expansion, and then you have the bringing back of everything, all these recollections and this stuff that is brought from the outside to the inside and creates this interiority, which is, I mean, it's interesting because so many architecture and other historians have written about the 19th century, the bourgeois interior, the psychological stuffiness, the Corbusier and the invention of the private eye shows, Hans and Benjamin, all these things. So there's this huge literature on
absolutely. So
on this.
And in some ways, so that chapter in some ways is perhaps some ways subversive, and in some ways just extensive. In the sense, I mean, one of those. So the fantastic. I mean, still, I think it's a literature. I would say, particularly from maybe 20 years ago, I mean, around the beginning of the 2000s, when people start focusing on the link between the interior of minds and the interior of rooms, all of that, which then draws on some earlier work from the 1980s, which talks about the Victorian or the 19th century interior as a special, newly fabricated thing, and in some ways this simply moves the dates back a bit, but I think it in an interesting way. I mean, I would say that the discourse, as far as I've read it, that chapter was produced as an article in Grey Room with an incredibly helpful and very, very good editor who was pointing out the extent to which it's overlapping other people's arguments. And what I would say is, from what I've read, the discourse you read tends to focus on the psychological, the interior is the interior of the mind and the interior room. And this seems very fun that it opens it up to being something about a geography, and that I think is kind of a fun addition. So I don't think it contradicts, but I think it sort of it sort of adds to a little bit that.
It is like
very logical.
It's like the counterpart of the first chapter. You have the second chapter, which
absolutely, they're very linked.
And the chapter that somehow intersects them both is the third one, about moving things. And there are two obelisks appearing in the book.
Yes.
And here's the first one, moving this Cleopatra's Needle.
Yes.
And you begin with this, how this shipwreck in 1870 or something?
1878,
78. The shipwreck when they were supposed to transport. You tell the story. It's a fascinating story. and a lot of nice images and clips.
Lots of very good images. Yeah, it's very hard to talk about the book without the images. Well, the third chapter is called Moving Large Things About in the 19th Century, and it's about moving large things about in the 19th century. It links to the previous two, and obviously you can imagine this is slightly kind of mind-bending in terms of content, but I think that all of the chapters are still dwelling on the fact that the extent to which you can think of architectural discourses as being around movement in different ways.
Yeah, sure.
And the other thing about, I guess, the chapters tend to drop in on a sort of image or an icon to start the story, so they're all anecdotes. And this one starts with a sort of incredibly gripping picture, partly autobiographical, because the picture is a picture of this ship that was built to transport Cleopatra's Needle from Alexandria. It's been in the sand for sort of 2,000 years. It's moved to London as a sort of classical kind of colonialist piece of very odd kind of trade, you could say. It's a sort of victory of English to 19th century out-of-the-box engineering to build a ship around an obelisk, and the ship kind of fails. It turns over. It flips on its side. And then the story of that whole chapter is very much about the way in which mediations and material objects start to get confused in a kind of hyper-mediated environment, and the effect that has on architecture generally. So the image that the chapter starts with is an image from the Illustrated London News, which is probably seen by a couple of million people one Saturday, of this ship turning over on its own in a storm in the Bay of Biscay. The image is actually derived out of a sketch. One person was lost, but most people got home. They just got onto the tug that was towing the boat and came back to London and then reported. And by the time they knew that the image was, the obelisk was lost, it had already been found. By the time it's published the loss, they've already discovered the obelisk. But the sketch on which this image was based was produced by the captain of the ship, and the captain of the ship was my great-great-uncle. So this was very much part of my personal history. I was introduced to this image when I was very small as a sort of amazingly powerful object. But what the chapter does is really try to unfold what is going on in that image, both because it's the sort of centre of what we think of, absolute, secure, sort of masterful colonialism. This is like when Britain is as powerful as it gets, and our expectation is that we still fail to understand how people could have done what they did. At the same time, the images that are made of this transport, of this sort of victorious transferal of a piece of indigenous culture to London, all of the images concentrate on instability, and so a little bit the chapter is to kind of unquestion to the extent to which things appeared stable, and to argue that actually in some way the foundation appears unstable. I mean, it's sort of a notion that you can have a foundation which is unstable, which is what makes architecture in the 19th century.
I thought in the first chapter...
He lectured.
No, but almost like a kind of trilogy. First you have the problem about naval architecture, then you have the return to the inside, creation of the interior, which is also about bringing things back from the outside, and then you have a problem about getting them back. So
Yeah.
you have the translation which fails. So so it's about the movement.
The movement, and also the heaviness of. I mean, I still think the best slightly stupid joke in the book is there's a point at which, well, it's maybe case too old to say, but this story about moving the obelisk that ends up on the Place de la Concorde in Paris. I mean, moving obelisks is a thing you do in the 19th century. But there's a fantastic book that the French produce about Egypt after they've invaded Egypt. And I kind of claim that the weight of the summed weight of all the individual copies of the edition, a 1,000-page edition of this huge book, way more than the obelisk. I mean, so that the mediation is a sort of very odd Victor Hugo kind of
it's an interesting remark.
weird that the mediated image is physically heavier than
the cabins to move those.
And that somehow you lose your distinction between the mediated image and the object which is being mediated, which in terms of architecture and argument of architecture is very sensible, that you stop thinking architecture is a building and that building is then mediated, but the mediation is part of the architecture.
The second part of the book, which is called Dispatches, we are chronology is 1530 to 1910. It's a more difficult cut in time, as it were. But as I read the second part, which has like 2 chapters, it's more about, fearing in some sense. It's more about representation, about drawing, about architectural theory in a more perhaps classical sense. And you begin with which goes back to your early work on Alberti, the notion of decorum, and how you read the concept of decorum in a particular way as connected to a certain type of instability, right? The decorum is so how do you read decorum?
Well,
the fitting,
the argument. I mean, the agenda of the second part of the book. I mean, as we go chapter by chapter, I get more and more kind of. It sounds more like a crazy project, but in one way,
it's a very fun. More logical.
It's more logical. It's a fun project, but the second part of the book tries to talk about certain constructions that make us look at architecture in particular ways, I would guess. And my early work that I did about Alberti, most of it was informed by a kind of suspicion that the way we tend to conceptualize certain things which architects hold dear was A, a construction, B, maybe we don't quite read that construction correctly. And so one of those is the notion of appropriateness, which architects predictably go back to. However outrageous what we're trying to persuade people to do is, we will tend to suggest that there's an appropriateness in what we're doing. So being appropriate is, we have a sort of very schizophrenic relationship to appropriateness, that we want to shock, but we tend to couch arguments in the notion of appropriateness. And so that chapter, which is out of the oldest work, came out of work which said, well, what is the history of this term in architecture? How is it being conceptualized? And in my work, it was kind of claiming that there was you could look at decorum 2 ways. You could look at it as a 16th century predictive decorum, which is about things being proper, which comes in Serlion, it comes in the sort of discourse of the 16th century. But somehow, or somehow before that, there's a notion of decorum which is much more amoral and flexible, which is what is appropriate is what gets you the vote. Trump is the height of decorum in that sense. Trump climbing out of the garbage truck is an absolute highest grade stay R piece of decorum. I mean, it's just said the right thing at the right time to persuade people to do things. And this is a very different notion to the notion of moralized decorum. But somehow my interest in that chapter was to say that there has been, in architecture, there's been a sort of acknowledgement at one point that this was what appropriateness might mean, and sort of try and track the history of why that hasn't always been accepted as what architecture should be. Because in one way, architects are very odd when they do rhetoric. They have a very complex relationship to what they say, and what they do is very, very separated. So
it's interesting because you have a section there where you discuss Alberti's De Pictura della Pittura, and you retranslate the Italian dedication where he speaks about. What's that? What are you doing there? It's a very intriguing part.
Well, what I'm doing is trying to say. I mean, there's one part there's a dedication to Alberti's della Pittura. Obviously, a super important treatise, but it has a dedication to Brunelleschi, which is one of the very early uses of the term architect at all. So more or less before architects have been invented, Alberti is talking to praising Brunelleschi architetto as an architect. And the traditional way of interpreting that is that Brunelleschi is an architect because he's somehow pushed through his own project against all odds to be realised, and the traditional emphasis is very much on a kind of notion that this would be appropriate in a sort of moral sense, and the retake or the retranslation suggests that what he was doing was the opposite of appropriateness in terms of what had been done before, what nature would suggest was correct, all the kind of moral ideas about appropriateness being fitting. Brunelleschi's dome is a very unfitting, very strange object. And the suggestion is that it's that unfittingness or quality of it that is being praised. So in this early praise of an architect, what is being praised is not the fact that he's kind of done another huge monument, as what everyone would expect, but he's done something which is extremely unexpected. And that seems very, very fun, because it sort of upsets.
So, I mean, yes, the quality of the stunning and the unprecedented in Brunelleschi. If I remember, I didn't check the footnotes in your book, but isn't that what Tafuri says in Teoria dell'Architettura, that this breaks with the past, is completely unprecedented? Maybe you quote him, I don't know.
I don't quote Tafuri, but I think there's one footnote which I think is kind of fun, which is the sort of mini history of the work that went on in translation around 2000, around between 1990 to 2000, where in some ways I would say partly the link between rhetoric and oratory and architecture was very much kind of claimed by a series, but in quite a conservative way. And there was a very odd kind of spat between Tafuri's interpretation and the people who became very dominant in the 1990s, who taught me, amongst them Joseph Hickworth, Robert Taverner, who kind of said, we don't want to deal with this inconvenient stuff. And Tafuri's interpretation of Alberti, which was hilarious, it was like not allowed to be mentioned in the group that I was kind of taught by.
But you are close to Tafuri, right?
Yeah, I'm very much closer to it. But so that footnote is kind of saying this was a kind of, there is this history of the way in which the discourse was interpreted, and you need to look back. I mean, but it's not just Tafuri. I mean, Eugenio Gardin, who is like a very super important Italian literature figure, interpreted Alberti in a much more kind of complex way than was done in the Anglo-Saxon context later. So Tafuri, I think, draws on really what was quite a well-established tradition of interpreting Alberti in Italy, right away from the 1960s. So he wasn't so unusual or surprising, but he was kind of, there was another set of ideas put in place around Alberti very effectively in architecture in the 1980s and 90s, which sort of put the lid on very much on the Tafuri's interpretations.
I mean, obviously there's a long tradition of reading Alberti back and forth in all kinds of ways. Someone who, you say, has been less favorite treatise of architectural history is this Domenico Fontana, who does the second obelisk movement thing and his work, which also has to do with graphic representation stability. So it comes back a little bit to naval architecture thing and also to the Opera's Nivel. So what is going on here? It's
well, I think
1590. I think.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about Fontana is that treatise is never. It has now been, again, it was also readdressed, reprinted, retranslated in the end of the 1980s, 1990s. But there's a whole kind of tradition of interpretation that says, this is engineering.
Yeah.
And now we'll deal with architecture.
Yeah.
So it's
machinazio.
It's machinazio, but it's tended to be considered not as an architectural treatise.
Yeah.
At the same time, it has the most stunning drawings of almost any architectural treatise that was ever produced, and he is very, very extremely clearly presenting himself as an architect.
Yeah.
The things he's doing that are clever there are the things that an architect does that are clever. So his claim is, what I'm doing here, this is the middle of architecture. Yeah. So he is extremely much claiming that aspect of machinatio as what he's doing. But I guess the argument that I make there is that it was getting very tricky at the end of the 16th century to claim that as the central aspect of an architectural practice.
Because the development of graphic representation tended towards stability, it became a kind of codification.
The way architects were, the way architectural drawing develops from Serlio through Vignola to Palladio is about you draw lines around that which does not move. That is the principle.
So there were no illustrations in Alberti, but then illustrations came and they produced this kind of stabilization of the object.
In a very odd way. And I went to one of the obviously one of the people who has done very interesting work around this is Ingrid Rowland, who translated both Vitruvius, the new one, and worked on the translation of Fontana. And I went to a very interesting lecture recently of her where all the things I claim about Alberti being kind of more flexible, she claims about Vitruvius. So her Vitruvius is much, much, much more interesting. So she just says Vitruvius has been killed by translation, which is very conservative translation. And her take is something weird happens in around 1519, which changes the way people think about architecture and makes it very, very much more conservative. And she argues it's to do with the Reformation. I don't know if it is. But certainly the developing tradition of architectural drawing, which starts basically in 1500 and then blossoms and becomes incredibly strategic, makes it more and more difficult to claim credit as an architect for doing things like lifting things up. Lifting things up is not something you can really show very well with the tradition of architectural drawing. Renaissance architectural drawing. Palladio's drawings, everything is still. And so I think I love Fontana as an example of how do you subvert a whole system of drawing to talk about the thing you want to talk about, because that's really what those drawings do.
Here's one of the few points we're making. Perhaps, interesting leap towards the present, or almost the present speaking. This could be like images, from Cedric Price or Super Studio or something.
Absolutely.
It's a kind of surprising leap in history too. But I get it, obviously.
Well, one of the images, which is the most perhaps oddest image in Fontana, and I think that's the fun thing. I think about looking at the Renaissance is that it's so hard to look at anything with surprise because you're told how to look, and so you could put a picture of God knows what in a Renaissance, regardless of what the image is, you just assume that it's normal. And there's one image in Fontana which shows this obelisk that is the centre of the story that is moved around St. Peter's, and he draws the obelisk as if the obelisk is there and the rest of Rome isn't. So the whole context is it is like a super studio drawing. It's just a sort of empty landscape. And so, whether it was super studio or not, the claim was, well, this is not what we expect to be shown when we're looking at a drawing of this period that we think we know about.
So this leap to the present is then perhaps consummated in the third part, vehicles, 1890 to 1960, right? We have two chapters, one on Warburg, on his library, which is a very detailed description of the various displacements of Warburg's library from Hamburg to 3 or 4 places in England, 3 places I think, and then we come back to Slussen in Stockholm, so it's slightly perhaps. Warburg, which is but the detailed description of the various architectural settings for his library. And there's obviously the connection between Bildung and building, as you say, but I wasn't really sure about the point here. This is one of to be. I'm not being critical here, but you seem to be so enamored in this description of it.
Sure.
So I wasn't sure where the argument was.
Well, I think that's a fair comment. I think partly because that way of writing history, where you just you discover stuff and you think it's fun. But I think that the argument, I think that's fair, is a little bit unstated there, because if you wanted to make a theory about architecture which included movement, then I think Warburg would be your kind of, or Warburg and the tradition of the Warburg Institute would be a kind of first port of call. And maybe the intriguing part about, for me anyway, the intriguing part was the extent to which they seem to enact their idea of cultural change in their own history. So it's kind of very carefully, they constructed this, and obviously they navigated Fortuna and all sorts of crazy things going on, so they're not completely in charge of the narrative. But their reactions in the narrative seem to curate the notion of kind of cultural exchange and survival that is theorized in everything they're writing. And so this sort of doubling of, you have an intellectual sphere where you're supposedly understanding how culture has changed through time, and a practice which seems to do something very, very similar in your own time, I think is very, very intriguing. So I guess I think it's both perhaps there isn't enough of a sort of overt explanation of the way Warburg's ideas might inform architecture, but I think one of the things which perhaps is not stated enough, but when we presented this within this context of Warburg studies, people haven't really thought architecture is very important for Warburg, despite the fact that Warburg is all about things moving from one place to another. And so the bigger argument is that actually Warburg's thinking is very, very architectural from the beginning. So it's a little bit of things which are kind of perhaps not well drawn out.
I was very intrigued by these various houses with two entrances, this married or unmarried couple, I would say. I mean, I wasn't sure how to connect that to, this is an empirical fact, this strange family formation, but how does that tie in with the story about Fabra?
Well, I think
it's a fascinating story.
I think it has, does it tie in? Maybe it just doesn't tie in, but I think so the history of the two entrances is
maybe you can describe it. I mean,
I can sort of tell the story quickly. So the overall chapter talks about the way. Again, it's sort of autobiographical. I worked in the building that was built for the Warburg Institute in London in the 1980s before it had been renovated. Very, very eerie and strange building, and was fascinated by it, and kind of was curious to write that history. So it was sort of a long-term project. And when in writing the history, then what seemed to become a theme was that there was all the way through the history of this institution, which built buildings. Well, part of the institution continuously commissioned architecture without a stop from 1926 to 1958, at the same time as it was moved, and at the same time as they developed notions about cultural survival, which were about the recurrence of things from the past and the present. In that, there were a series of actors who took the kind of reins of this institution, and two of the actors, one called Fritz Saxel and the other called Gertrude Bing, became the director and assistant director and had their own kind of complex life and love story, which also concerned relocation and playing out again of certain narratives in different forms in different places during their lives. So I think I kind of make the claim that the fact of the kind of factual material was that they had once made or asked an architect to draw a house for them. They'd commissioned a house which hadn't been built, but the concerns in this house and the way they were going to live in this house appeared to be reflected in the way that they lived together later. So I think and I make a claim that this project could be kind of emblematic of a Warburgian thinking about architecture, where things come back, where things return, and where particularly ritual and sort of things in motion, the organisation and the movement of within an architecture is very, very central to defining how that architecture means, I suppose. So that they could occupy almost any building and make an architecture in it that was to do with their notion of architecture.
So it would be like this couple, they could occupy any kind of building and still be very unhappy.
Well, I don't know if they were happy about this.
I had the sense that I was expecting that this weird marriage somehow be reflected into the structures of the Warburg. Maybe I was looking at it from the wrong angle.
Yeah, maybe. I can't answer that. I don't have a good answer to that. But I think that there's all that sort of odd stuff about architecture as the thinking of certain people who moved through the Warburg Institute, particularly Francis Yates, who writes in the 1960s about memory. That all of that thinking is kind of born out of this kind of reenactment of the past in the spaces that they're making the thinking in. And it seems that these two characters are incredibly engaged in doing the same thing.
So coming to the end now, I mean, that chapter earlier, you have a small down at the end, but I mean, this early electric brings us here to Sweden again, and to Slussen, which is one of the most debated things in contemporary architecture in Stockholm, and the present and the past, and all these things are intertwined. So I think this is one of the most, I think this chapter that someone who's not really into architectural theory would have the most easy access to.
Yeah, sure.
And you, I'm not sure how you feel about this renovating on the Slussen. I was actually looking for where you were standing in this debate. I couldn't see it, but it doesn't matter. But you have a very complex reading of the past and the present, and how do you perceive this transformation being wrought upon Stockholm, in the central of Stockholm?
I think it's really awful, actually. But I had this idea of. I think what's interesting, it looks like it's been done in Minecraft. You notice that, the actual physicality of it. I think, but I don't know if I think it's really awful just because I'd have no idea whether it's nostalgia or whether it really is awful.
I think
there can be all sorts of good reasons.
Is important here, but it's the historical
take.
But
I think the historical take is that the thing I thought was very nice to point out was the extent to which the notion of Slussen is a sluice is a lock, right? And Slussen is a point in the city of Stockholm where there is a kind of knot where a lot of different networks have to cross a not very wide piece of water. And there's been a kind of history of traffic congestion. So it's a place of congestion that's in the middle of the city. But it's also a kind of theatre in the middle of the city. It's a place where you can go and see the city. And one thing and I suppose the other thing to say is that in the kind of peak of Sweden's sort of career as a welfare state nation, where you believe that architecture can fix anything, they did a very big intervention here. There's a very famous modernist intervention and created an object which is a traffic intersection which has just been removed, which is nostalgic. People are very sad about it being removed. And the piece that I thought hadn't been talked about so much was the extent to which the identity of the place had been built up in a very, very modernistic way before the invention of this, for the insertion of this very sort of modernist-looking traffic intersection. The traffic intersection was very, very concerned with circulation and revolution. Everything had to go round. Everyone had to go round at least once to get to Slussen. And the very simply observation in the chapter is that Slussen, or this area of Stockholm, was the kind of epicenter of Stockholm as it existed in film. And so the construction of the space of the modern city in the film seems to have been the place where the invention could have happened, and it was possible to reinvent the space because it had already been reinvented in a medium that was to do with the 20th century, and that's the kind of.
I think one of the most crucial parts is obviously now this stress on the cinematic experience of the city, how that structures also the perception of Slussen at the time, perhaps, and it was perceived. But there's the second part of it, which is the gondola, the restaurant, which is like the opposite, the other part of the system. You have and there's a very intriguing dialectic between Slussen as this traffic junction and the gondola.
Yes, and then, well, I suppose that for me comes out of film. That film is in film. There's a very odd meeting, especially these early films, where you film ourselves. I mean, I guess like now we film ourselves, and that becomes entertainment. So it's a very odd meeting between functionalism and kind of, I don't know if excess is the right word, but I mean it's very easy to start thinking of functionalism in terms of efficiency and reduction and effectiveness, and all of film of course is produced. You produce something extra which, once you film something you can make them pay to look at the image that you've made, and there's another notion of an economy in that. And so that aspect of a mixture between sort of extreme rationalism and extreme fantasy seems to be built into solutions. So the argument there is that partly this is the most rationalist system in the world, but at the same time it has to incorporate something which is absolutely about a kind of perfect fiction, which is a gondola of an airship that might fly off to Buenos Aires tomorrow while you're eating lunch in it. I mean, that notion that those two things are tied together. And then I think this is very fun. I have no way of, way beyond my pay grade, but I thought it was hilarious to remember this The Life of Walter Mitty short story, which Thurber produces at exactly the same time, far away, of course, in New York, but it was just in the same period, which does this similar sort of linking of the sort of mechanics of commuting, of rationalism with sort of excess and distance. And I suppose I'm very optimistic about Sweden. So I think that in some way this curation of Sweden is much more healthy. That somehow we talk about commuter as hero, commuter as slave, but somehow in Sweden seems to be allowing people to be both.
I was going to end now, but I have to ask a final question, which is about what is not in the book, or what could be in the second book. You say it's time to. The first section say now it's time to reach the 20th century. So okay, well we're in the 21st century. So I mean, there's the things that move, that produce a kind of hinterland or architectural history, and if we look at our present, I mean, movement, all these things are everywhere. I mean, compared to the present, most of these things are very still.
Yes, that's true.
So what is our hinterland? Is there a hinterland for us? Or do you see what I'm saying?
Write a book called Things That Don't Move.
Is that what, I don't know, are we just witnessing the kind of things you're describing, just as an intensification of that? Or is there some shift?
One thing I would say, but we didn't talk about that now, but when in the chapter about Vitruvius at the beginning, I kind of make a disclaimer, because I say this isn't exactly just about that everything is in movement, but I kind of make a claim that there's a very interesting architectural point, which is at the moment between things being stationary and moving. That there is a kind of very special situation, which maybe is maybe something which we've left behind. But it seems, I kind of make a claim that there's a very powerful moment, and I talk about this thing about the moment the train moves, stops being still and starts being moving. I mean the point at which either what is moving can become still, or what is still can become moving. And I would say that it would be very interesting to think about that in terms of the present.
A very obvious thing one might say is from a really other vantage point would be, say, since the current discourse is that everything is moving, it is made up to cover over the fact that everything is still. Because nothing changes.
No, it doesn't change.
Because everything seems to be moving, but it's actually repeating itself, running in circles. And this could be one of the perhaps major facets of the contemporary digital world, that nothing changes.
Actually, nothing changes.
Nothing changes, but it's like an image of perpetual change
without change.
Without change. But you have to write a second book about that. A sequel. No, but it's a fascinating book. As I said, there's so many things I never heard of, so I have to go back and read it again. I have to read the footnotes, but it's a fascinating read. Thanks. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the time.